There is a question almost nobody wants to ask out loud, because the moment you ask it, you begin noticing things that are difficult to ignore. What if the greatest crisis facing modern society isn't economic, political, or technological? What if the real battle is happening somewhere most people never think to look? And what if, according to one of the most controversial voices in modern Catholic circles, that battle has already begun? For years, discussions about spiritual warfare were pushed to the margins. They belonged in old books, forgotten monasteries, and stories from another age. Modern life seemed to have moved beyond them. Science advanced. Technology connected the world. Information became available instantly. Humanity appeared to be entering an era of unprecedented control over its own destiny, but something unexpected happened along the way. The more connected people became, the more isolated many felt. The more comforts increased, the more anxiety seemed to spread. The more entertainment filled every waking moment, the harder it became for countless individuals to find meaning. And while experts debated causes and solutions, a different interpretation emerged from a corner of the world that many had stopped paying attention to. That interpretation comes from priests, theologians, and exorcists who believe the crisis isn't merely psychological, cultural, or political. They believe it is spiritual. And few voices have expressed that concern more forcefully than Chad Ripperger. Now, whether someone agrees with him or not is almost beside the point. What makes his message remarkable is the urgency behind it. Because according to him, the world is not drifting gradually toward a spiritual crisis. It is already living through one. That claim immediately raises an uncomfortable question. If a crisis is already here, why do so few people recognize it? The answer he offers is startling, because the most effective battles are the ones where people don't realize they're fighting at all. Think about that for a moment. Throughout history, civilizations prepared themselves for visible threats. Armies could be seen. Borders could be defended. Enemies could be identified. But what happens when the threat is invisible? What happens when the battlefield isn't a country or a city, but the human mind, the family, the culture, and the soul? According to this perspective, that is exactly what is happening now. And the signs, he argues, are everywhere, not in dramatic movie scenes, not in sensational headlines, but in the ordinary realities of everyday life. A rising sense of confusion, a growing inability to distinguish truth from falsehood, families struggling to remain intact, communities becoming fragmented, people searching desperately for meaning while simultaneously rejecting the institutions that once provided it. At first glance, these may seem like separate problems, independent developments, unrelated trends unfolding across modern society. But Ripperger argues something very different. He believes they are connected, not randomly, not accidentally, but as part of a larger pattern. And once you begin examining that pattern, another question emerges. Why now? Why would so many people feel spiritually exhausted at precisely the moment humanity appears more technologically powerful than ever? That contradiction sits at the center of his warning, because technological advancement was supposed to solve human problems. Greater knowledge was supposed to reduce confusion. More freedom was supposed to increase fulfillment. Yet for many people, the opposite seems to have happened. For the search for meaning has intensified rather than disappeared. And that search leads us into territory that modern culture often avoids. For centuries, religion taught that human beings are more than biological organisms, more than consumers, more than collections of desires and impulses. They are spiritual beings. If that premise is true, then every human life contains dimensions that cannot be measured by economics, politics, psychology, or technology alone. And if those dimensions are ignored, consequences follow. This is where the story becomes increasingly provocative. Because Ripperger argues that modern society has not simply forgotten the spiritual dimension of life. It has actively trained itself to dismiss it. Generation after generation, countless people have grown up in environments where spiritual realities are treated as myths, symbols, or outdated traditions. The supernatural became something to explain away rather than investigate. At first, that seemed liberating. Old fears disappeared. Ancient warnings lost their influence. Traditional religious practices faded into the background. But according to his view, removing awareness of the spiritual world did not remove the spiritual world itself. It only removed people's ability to recognize it. And that changes everything. Imagine entering a battlefield while believing battle itself is imaginary. Imagine walking into danger while being convinced danger does not exist. How would you defend yourself? How would you prepare? How would you even know what to watch for? This is where the warning begins to sharpen. Because Ripperger insists that many people are not suffering from a lack of intelligence. They are suffering from a lack of spiritual awareness. And those are not the same thing. A person can possess extraordinary education and still be blind to certain realities. History is filled with examples. Entire civilizations have been confident right before collapse. Entire cultures have mistaken prosperity for permanence. Entire generations have assumed that the future would simply continue improving because the present felt stable. Then everything changed. The Roman Empire believed it would endure forever. However, it didn't. Powerful kingdoms vanished, great institutions crumbled. Systems that appeared invincible disappeared into history. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that confidence can become a form of blindness. And blindness creates vulnerability. According to this worldview, that vulnerability is precisely what concerns him most. Because the modern person often feels strongest when they may actually be weakest. They trust information but neglect wisdom. They value comfort but avoid sacrifice. They pursue success but struggle to define purpose. And while none of those tendencies seem dangerous in isolation, together they create conditions that, according to this perspective, leave individuals spiritually exposed. But here's where the story takes an even more surprising turn. Because Ripperger does not primarily focus on governments. He does not primarily focus on corporations. He does not even primarily focus on institutions. He focuses on families. And the reason is simple. Every civilization depends on them. Long before there are nations, there are families. Long before there are economies, there are families. Long before there are schools, political movements, or cultural revolutions, there are families. Which means that if someone wanted to reshape an entire society, where would they begin? Not at the top, at the foundation. And foundations are rarely destroyed all at once. They erode gradually. A small crack appears, then another, then another. For years, everything seems fine. The structure remains standing. The danger feels distant. Invisible, until one day the damage can no longer be ignored. According to Ripperger's analysis, modern culture has been living through precisely that process. Not an overnight collapse, a slow unraveling, one that many people failed to notice because each individual change seemed manageable on its own. But when enough changes accumulate, something larger emerges. And that larger pattern, he argues, reveals a society losing confidence in the very things that once held it together. Yet this is also where his message becomes unexpectedly hopeful. Because every warning implies a possibility. If decline is unavoidable, warnings are pointless. Nobody warns people about what cannot be changed. Warnings exist because action remains possible. And that distinction matters a lot, because despite the severity of his language, the core of his message is not ultimately about fear. It is about preparation. Preparation for challenges. Preparation for suffering. Preparation for uncertainty. Preparation for moments when faith, conviction, and character are tested. History suggests those moments eventually arrive for everyone. The only question is whether people recognize them when they do. And according to Ripperger, recognition begins with a difficult realization. The greatest threats are often the ones that appear harmless, the habits that slowly shape a life, the assumptions that quietly guide decisions. The compromises that seem insignificant in the moment, because major transformations rarely begin with dramatic events. They begin with ordinary choices repeated thousands of times. A culture changes because people change. Families change because habits change. Lives change because priorities change. And before anyone notices, an entirely different world emerges. Which brings us to perhaps the most unsettling part of the warning. What if the crisis isn't approaching? What if it isn't waiting somewhere beyond the horizon? What if the reason so many people feel anxious, disconnected, and uncertain is because they are already living through it? And if that's true, then another question immediately follows. What does preparation actually look like? Because identifying a problem is one thing. Responding to it is another. According to Ripperger's perspective, the answer begins in a place most people least expect. Not in politics, not in social media, not in public debates, but in the hidden decisions made when nobody is watching, the choices that shape character, the disciplines that build resilience, the practices that strengthen conviction, the habits that determine who a person becomes when pressure finally arrives. And pressure always arrives. History guarantees it. The only uncertainty is the form it takes. For some, it arrives as personal tragedy. For others, economic hardship. For others, social isolation. For others, a crisis of meaning so profound that it changes the direction of an entire life. But according to this worldview, those moments do more than reveal character. They reveal foundations. And a foundation cannot be built during a storm. It must exist before the storm begins. Which raises a final question. If foundations are what matter most, why has modern society spent so much time focusing on everything else? Because the answer to that question leads directly into the heart of Ripperger's most controversial argument, an argument about belief, meaning sacrifice, and the invisible forces he believes are shaping the modern world in ways few people fully understand. And Once we examine that argument, the warning becomes even more difficult to ignore if that argument sounds extreme. That's because it forces us to confront a possibility that modern culture rarely entertains. The possibility that the deepest struggles of our age cannot be solved merely by changing policies, electing leaders, inventing technologies, or accumulating more wealth. Those things may address symptoms, but according to the worldview we're examining, the root problem lies much deeper. It lies in what people worship, whether they realize they are worshiping something or not. Because every civilization organizes itself around an ultimate value. If that value is God, one kind of culture emerges. If that value is power, pleasure, status, consumption, or self-expression, an entirely different culture emerges. And once that shift occurs, the consequences spread everywhere. This is why Ripperger's warning is not primarily about dramatic supernatural events. Ironically, those are the things that attract the most attention. People become fascinated with stories of exorcisms, possessions, and spiritual phenomena because they feel extraordinary. But his actual concern is far more ordinary, and therefore far more dangerous. It is the slow normalization of spiritual indifference, the gradual process through which people stop asking ultimate questions, the subtle drift that convinces someone they can postpone faith, postpone repentance, postpone truth, postpone transformation until some future date that never arrives. And that's where the danger begins to escalate, because every delay creates another delay. Every compromise makes the next compromise easier. Every neglected responsibility becomes the foundation for future neglect. Human beings rarely wake up one morning completely transformed into different people. Instead, they arrive there one small decision at a time. They move inch by inch until the distance between who they are and who they once intended to become becomes almost impossible to recognize. Yet even here, another question emerges. If the situation is truly as serious as these warnings suggest, why isn't everyone collapsing into despair? The answer is fascinating because it reveals the most important part of the entire message: hope, not optimism, not wishful thinking, not the assumption that everything will automatically improve. Real hope, the kind that survives even when circumstances do not. History provides countless examples. Some of humanity's greatest saints, reformers, and leaders emerged during periods of chaos rather than stability. Their greatness was not formed despite hardship. It was formed because of hardship. The pressure revealed something that comfort never could. It exposed strengths that otherwise would have remained hidden. This pattern repeats throughout history with remarkable consistency. When societies become comfortable, conviction often weakens. But when challenges arrive, people are forced to decide what truly matters. They discover which beliefs were merely inherited and which beliefs are actually their own. They discover whether their values can survive sacrifice. They discover whether their principles remain intact when there is a cost attached to them. According to this perspective, that process is already underway. And that realization changes the entire story, because suddenly the question is no longer, what is happening to the world? The question becomes, what is happening to me? Am I becoming stronger or weaker, more disciplined or more distracted, more rooted or more fragmented, more capable of facing hardship or more dependent on comfort? Those questions are uncomfortable because they remove the possibility of blaming everyone else. They shift responsibility back to the individual. They force a person to examine the foundations of their own life rather than simply criticizing the failures of society. And perhaps that is why so many people avoid them. Self-examination is difficult. Transformation is difficult. Change is difficult. But history repeatedly demonstrates that civilizations are ultimately shaped by individuals who are willing to do difficult things. That principle becomes especially important when discussing the future, because one of the most striking elements of Ripperger's message is his insistence that preparation cannot begin after the crisis arrives. By then, most of the important decisions have already been made. Character has already been formed. Habits have already been established. Foundations have already been built or neglected. Think about a tree during a storm. The storm does not create the roots. The storm reveals them. A tree survives because of work that happened long before the wind appeared. And according to this worldview, human beings are no different. The future belongs not necessarily to the strongest, wealthiest, or most influential people, but to those who have developed resilience before adversity arrives, those who have learned discipline before temptation appears, those who have cultivated conviction before confusion spreads. That preparation, however, requires something modern culture often discourages: patience. Real transformation is slow. Growth is slow. Wisdom is slow. Everyone wants immediate results, immediate answers, immediate certainty. But the most important developments in human life rarely happen that way. They unfold gradually, often invisibly, through countless ordinary choices that seem insignificant in the moment. One prayer, one act of discipline, one sacrifice. One decision to do what is right instead of what is easy, then another, then another. Years later, those decisions have shaped an entirely different person. And this brings us to perhaps the most powerful lesson hidden beneath all the warnings. The future is not determined solely by the forces acting upon us. It is also determined by how we respond to them. Every generation faces challenges it did not choose. Every generation inherits problems it did not create. But every generation must still decide what kind of people it will become. That choice remains. It always remains. And according to the perspective explored throughout this story, that choice may be more important now than many realize, because regardless of where someone stands on theology, religion, or spiritual warfare, one fact remains undeniable. We live in an age of extraordinary distraction, an age where attention is constantly fragmented, an age where endless noise competes for every moment of silence. And perhaps that is why the final challenge is so simple. Stop drifting. Stop assuming there will always be more time. Stop waiting for certainty before taking action. Whether the battle is spiritual, cultural, personal, or all three at once, the principle remains the same. The people who survive difficult times are rarely the ones who saw every detail of the future. They are the ones who prepared themselves before the future arrived. And maybe that's the real warning, hidden inside everything you've heard. Not that darkness exists. Human beings have always known darkness exists, not that suffering exists. History has never hidden that reality. The warning is that comfort can convince people they are prepared when they are not. It can create the illusion of strength without requiring strength itself. It can make a civilization forget the disciplines, virtues, and convictions that once sustained it. But history also offers another lesson. Renewal often begins when decline appears inevitable. The greatest revivals frequently emerge from the deepest crises. The brightest lights are often noticed only after darkness has fallen, which means the story is not over. The final chapter has not been written. The future remains unwritten because it depends on decisions being made right now by ordinary people living ordinary lives. People choosing discipline over distraction, truth over convenience, purpose over comfort, faith over fear, and whether one accepts Ripperger's conclusions or rejects them entirely, that final challenge remains impossible to ignore. Because sooner or later, every person reaches a moment when excuses run out, distractions fade, and a choice must be made. A choice about what they believe, a choice about who they will become, a choice about what foundation they are building their life upon. And when that moment arrives, the question will not be whether the world changed. The question will be whether you did. Because if there is one lesson history teaches again and again, it is this: the people who endure the storm are rarely the people who hoped it would never come. They are the people who prepared while the sky was still clear. And according to this warning, that time is now.